The most terrifying place in the world wasn't a dark alley in a crumbling city or an abandoned warehouse, but a floating palace of glass and light, drifting through the Caribbean Sea. It was a place where laughter drifted through late-night discos, where the champagne never stopped flowing, and where no one asked too many questions about what happened once the cabin doors closed. On the Rhapsody of the Seas, there was a luxury that people saved years to experience. It smelled of salt air and expensive perfume, stretched wide and majestic, just another paradise on the water. But for one family, the illusion of safety was shattered in a silence so profound it still echoes today. For years, thousands of passengers walked down that gangway, but on a warm morning in March 1998, one young woman never came back. We are often told that evil hides in the shadows, in the places we are warned to avoid. But sometimes, a nightmare takes shape in the bright light of day, surrounded by 2,000 witnesses. We trust that when we step onto a ship, we are entering a contained world, a floating city governed by laws and protections. We believe that if something goes wrong, the world will stop to help us. But the open ocean is a wilderness. It is a jurisdiction of gray areas, where the laws of land dissolve into the laws of the sea, and where a person can vanish between the beat of a drum and the rising of the sun. Amy Lynn Bradley was 23 years old. She was a daughter, a sister, a skilled athlete, and a woman with a life waiting for her back in Virginia. She was a trained lifeguard, someone who knew the water, respected it, and feared it enough to never take unnecessary risks. She did not fall. She did not choose to leave. And yet, she was erased from a manifest reality, leaving behind only a pack of cigarettes, a lighter, and a silence that her family has been fighting to break for over 2 decades. Today, we are going to walk the decks of the Rhapsody of the Seas. We are going to look at the timeline of a disappearance that defies logic, examine the systemic failures of a maritime industry that prioritizes schedules over human life, and confront the chilling possibility that Amy didn't just vanish, she was taken. This is the story of a vacation that became a life sentence. To understand the tragedy, we must first understand the hesitation. In the spring of 1998, the Bradley family, Ron, Iva, their son Brad, and daughter Amy were preparing for what was supposed to be a celebration. Ron had recently retired, and the cruise was meant to be a reward, a moment of collective breath after years of hard work. But Amy wasn't sure she wanted to go. She had just moved into a new apartment. She had recently adopted a bulldog named Daisy. Her life was taking shape in Virginia, rooted in the things she loved. She was a bright young woman with a degree in physical education, a basketball player, a strong swimmer. There was a capability about her, a physical confidence that usually wards off the idea of victimhood. But friends would later recall that she felt an unease about the trip. Not a premonition, perhaps, but the reluctance of someone who was happy where she was. Eventually, she agreed. It was a family trip, a chance to be with the people she loved most. On March 21st, 1998, they flew to Puerto Rico to board the Rhapsody of the Seas. The ship was a titan of the Royal Caribbean Fleet, a vessel designed to make you forget the world you left behind. From the moment they stepped on board, the atmosphere was electric. But for Amy, the attention she received was almost immediate, and it wasn't just from fellow passengers. It came from the crew. In the service industry of a luxury cruise, attention is part of the product, but the Bradley family noted something different. The waiters, the deckhands, there was a gravitation toward Amy. She was beautiful, yes, with short dark hair and an athletic build, but the attention felt focused, eager. One waiter, in particular, seemed to cross the invisible line between service and fixation. He asked for her name. He asked where she was going. He wanted to know her schedule. At the time, it was just background noise, a nuisance. But looking back, it was the first thread in the web that was slowly being spun around her. Monday, March 23rd, the ship had left Oranjestad, Aruba, and was making its way toward Curaçao. The evening began with the elegance of a formal dinner. The Bradleys were dressed up, Ron in his suit, Amy in a dark dress. Photographs from that night show them smiling, raising glasses. It is the picture of a memory being made, the kind you frame and put on a mantelpiece. After dinner, the night opened up. The ship was alive with music. The Bradleys made their way to the upper deck to the disco, a a place of pulsing lights and Caribbean rhythms. The ship's band, Blue Orchid, was playing. This is where the timeline begins to tighten. Amy and her mother, Iva, danced. They drank pina coladas. The mood was celebratory. A member of the band, a man known as Yellow, Alistair Douglas, danced with Amy. To an outsider, it was just another moment of vacation exuberance, a crew member entertaining a guest. But in the context of what was to come, every interaction that night takes on a sinister weight. Around 1 a.m., Iva and Ron decided to call it a night. They were tired, but Amy and her brother Brad, along with clear-headed youth and the adrenaline of the music, decided to stay up. They moved to the ship's nightclub. They were surrounded by people, by the safety of numbers. But as the hours wore on, the crowd thinned, the music faded. By 3:35 a.m., Amy and Brad made their way back to the family's cabin, Suite 8563. They were safe. They were back in their room. The door was locked. The night should have ended there. But Amy was restless. Brad went to sleep. But Amy sat out on the private balcony. The sliding glass door was open, letting in the warm, humid air of the Caribbean. Brad would later recall talking to her for a while before drifting off. She seemed fine. She was just smoking a cigarette, watching the black water roll by. Perhaps thinking about Virginia, about her dog, about the life waiting for her. At around 5:15 a.m., Ron Bradley woke up. It was that early, quiet hour before the ship comes alive, when the engines are just a low hum in the floorboards. He saw Amy. She was sleeping on a lounge chair on the balcony. Her legs were curled up. It was a peaceful image. He didn't disturb her. He thought, as any father would, that she was safe. She was just feet away from him. The balcony door was closed. He went back to sleep. 45 minutes later, that is all it took. At 6 a.m., Ron woke up again. The sun was beginning to bleed light onto the horizon. He looked toward the balcony. The chair was empty. He stood up, expecting to find her in the bathroom, or perhaps she had slipped out to get coffee. He checked the cabin. Brad was still sleeping. Iva was sleeping. But Amy was gone. He saw her cigarettes, her lighter, her sandals. Amy Bradley, a woman who knew the risks of slippery decks, who was a trained lifeguard, had apparently left the cabin barefoot. She had left behind the only tool she used for her habit. She had left without her ID. Ron felt a coldness settle in his chest. He dressed quickly and stepped into the hallway. He walked the length of the corridor, checking the elevators, the stairs. He went up to the deck. It was 6 a.m. The ship was preparing to dock in Curaçao. The nightmare was taking shape. Panic is a slow-burning fuse. At first, you tell yourself there is a logical explanation. She's at the buffet. She's watching the sunrise from the upper deck. But as Ron searched, as he retraced the steps from the cabin to the public areas, the silence of the ship began to feel hostile. By 6:30 a.m., the family was awake. They were searching. They alerted the purser's desk. And here is where the tragedy shifts from a mystery to a systemic failure. The Rhapsody of the Seas was docking in Curaçao. The gangway was about to be lowered. Thousands of passengers were preparing to disembark for a day of sightseeing. The Bradleys pleaded with the crew, "Do not let anyone off this ship. Our daughter is missing." They needed a lockdown. They needed a head count. They needed the machinery of the crew's line to stop and prioritize a human life. But the machinery didn't stop. It didn't need to. The crew told the family that it was impossible to keep the passengers on board. They cited logistics. They cited schedules. And so, while Amy Bradley was missing, potentially hurt, potentially held against her will, potentially being smuggled off the very vessel she vanished from, the gangway was lowered. For hours, people streamed off the ship. If Amy was taken, her captors had a wide-open door. If she was lost on the ship, the noise and chaos of disembarkation buried any cry for help. The crew's response was sluggish. They suggested she might be hiding. They suggested she had met someone. They treated it as a domestic inconvenience rather than a dire emergency. They paged her name over the intercom, a hollow sound that drifted over the decks and out to sea, unanswered. It wasn't until the ship had fully docked and the passengers had scattered into Willemstad that a serious search began. But by then, the golden hour, that critical window where a victim could be recovered, had long since passed. The authorities, when they finally engaged, gravitated toward the simplest explanation, the one that absolved the crew's line of liability. She fell. They theorized she had leaned over the railing, lost her balance, and tumbled into the sea. Or perhaps, in a darker turn, she had jumped. But the physics didn't align. The family knew this. The railings on the Rhapsody of the Seas were high. Amy was an athlete with excellent balance. To fall accidentally would require a level of negligence that didn't fit her profile. To jump, she had a life she loved. She had a dog waiting. She had just bought a new car. There was no note, no depression, no goodbye. And then there was the water. The Dutch Caribbean Coast Guard conducted a 4-day search. They swept the ocean and the harbor. The water was clear if a body had gone into the sea at that time. The currents were predictable. They found nothing. No body, no debris. And remember the sandals. Who jumps into the ocean and their life, but worries about leaving their shoes behind? Who goes for a walk on a steel deck, slippery with morning dew, barefoot? The accident theory was a comfort to the crew's line, a way to close the file. But for the Bradleys, it was an insult. They knew their daughter hadn't fallen. She had been hunted. As the investigation turned inward, the focus returned to the night before, to the disco, to the band, to Alistair Douglas, the man known as Yellow. Witnesses reported seeing Yellow dancing with Amy. That in itself wasn't a crime, but his behavior the next morning was unsettling. According to the Bradleys, on the morning Amy disappeared, Yellow approached Brad. He handed him a drink. He said, "Sorry to hear about your sister." This was before the general announcement had been made, before the passengers knew she was missing. How did he know? When questioned, Douglas claimed he had heard the rumors. The ship is a small place. News travels fast. But there was more. He had been seen with her in the elevator. He had been seen trying to get her attention. The FBI eventually got involved, but their jurisdiction was limited. The ship was in international waters, flagged in a foreign country. The laws were a patchwork of indifference. Douglas was questioned, but there was no physical evidence linking him to a crime. He passed a polygraph, a tool we know is flawed and often used to clear the convenient suspects. He was let go, but the suspicion remained, a heavy cloud hanging over the case. Was he a predator, or was he a recruiter, a spotter for something much larger, much darker, that operated within the maritime network? The ship left Curaçao. The Bradleys did not. They stayed behind, searching the streets, showing photos to taxi drivers, shopkeepers, anyone who would look, and the whispers began. 5 months after the disappearance, in August 1998, a Canadian tourist named David Carmichael was on a beach in Curaçao. He saw a woman walking with 2 men. She looked out of place. She looked frightened. He noted her tattoos, a Tasmanian devil spinning a basketball on her shoulder, a gecko on her navel, a sun on her lower back. Specific, identifying marks. The woman looked at him. Her eyes were desperate, but the men hustled her away before she could speak. Carmichael didn't know about Amy Bradley then. When he saw her photo on Unsolved Mysteries months later, his blood ran cold. He was certain, but he wasn't the only one. In 1999, a member of the U.S. Navy visited a brothel in Curaçao. It was a place of misery, where women were commodities. He was approached by a young woman. She told him her name was Amy. She told him she was from Virginia. She begged him for help. She said she couldn't leave. The sailor, fearing for his career, fearing the repercussions of being in an illicit establishment, did nothing. He didn't report it immediately. He went back to his ship. Years later, the guilt broke him. He came forward. He described her tattoos perfectly. He described her voice. These weren't just sightings. They were cries for help from a hell that was running parallel to the tourist paradise. They suggested that Amy hadn't died that morning. She had been stolen, trafficked, forced into a life of exploitation, where her identity was stripped away layer by layer. In 2005, 7 years after she vanished, the family received an email. It contained a photo. The woman in the photo was posing on a bed. She looked exhausted, beaten down, but the facial structure, the jawline, the eyes, was uncannily like Amy's. The email claimed this woman was named Jazz, and she was being held in the Caribbean. The family sent the photo to experts, FBI analysts, facial recognition specialists. The results were inconclusive, but the resemblance was undeniable. It offered a glimmer of hope, a possibility that she was still alive, still fighting. But hope is a currency that predators know how to spend. Over the years, the Bradleys were targeted by con artists, men like Frank Jones, who promised he had a team of ex-special forces ready to rescue Amy. He took thousands of dollars from the desperate family. He fed them lies, fabricated reports of sightings, and spun a narrative of a rescue that was always just one day away. It was a scam. Jones had never seen Amy. He had never found her. He was simply feeding on their grief. This is the secondary trauma of a missing persons case. The vultures who circle the wound. The family was victimized not once, but repeatedly by a world that saw their pain as an opportunity for profit. Decades have passed since the Rhapsody of the Seas docked in Curaçao without Amy Lynn Bradley. The ship has been renamed, sold, repainted. The passengers from that cruise have moved on with their lives. But for the Bradley family, it is still the morning of March 24th, 1998. They are still standing in that cabin, looking at a pair of sandals and an empty chair. We want to believe that justice is inevitable. We want to believe that the truth always surfaces, like driftwood in the tide. But the ocean keeps its secrets well. And so do people. Amy's story is a terrifying reminder of how fragile our safety really is. It forces us to ask, how can a person vanish from a sealed environment? Who watched her? Who took her? And who looked the other way? What do you think still remains unresolved in this case? Do you believe justice was ever truly served? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments. And if you want to explore more stories like this, stories that demand reflection as much as they demand attention, remember, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the darkest crimes don't end when the killer is gone. They end when we finally listen.